So let's talk for a second about outsourcing. Now, one thing to remember is differentiating and parity are equally important. I have to have both. I have to be good at both. This needs to be better than, this needs to be as good as. Well, what if I'm going to, if I decide I've got some parity gaps to fill, I'm under par. One of the questions I need to ask myself is, how do I fill that parity gap? One way is I can do the work myself, or I can find somebody else to do it. If I've got differentiating gaps, my rule of thumb is I should never outsource filling those gaps. Because if I lack mission critical capability, or domain knowledge, or innovation in what's differentiating, that's a gap I better fill myself. Otherwise, I outsource what keeps me growing. That'd be a bad decision. For me, to me. You may think differently, I just think it's a bad decision. So, if I'm going to outsource parity feature function development, one of the things I need to think about, since parity is mission critical, it is as important as differentiating. I should only outsource it to people for whom that is differentiating. Think about that for a second. I'm only going to outsource it to people for whom it is their differentiating business. If I don't do that, I'll end up being under par some way, somehow. And the reason I say that is because parity changes over time. As soon as my competitors unleash some new differentiating feature or function, they just redefine parity. So if I'm not outsourcing to somebody for whom that's differentiating, over time I'm going to fall behind. Does that make sense? So did that finally answer your question?
Yeah, and also it's hard to, those who define themselves by, say, project management, aren't looking to partner with anyone.
True.
You know, so that's the hard part, that we always look for the little guys
right.
that are interested in us, and that's not necessarily good either.
And the other thing I do is, if I'm going to outsource any development, I have to make sure that they rigorously adhere to things like my architectural and software standards. Those are some of the requirements. Because otherwise, I'm creating complexity in parity, and parity complexity is a bad thing, because then it'll eventually end up costing me a whole bunch of time and money to simplify.
So yes. The other thing about parity, it's really parity for the users in some instances, because we get fixated on having parity with competition.
Right.
But if the parity is in, we have 50% of the features and no one uses,
right.
so do they. And sometimes we don't talk about that.
Right. Yeah, you really need to take an outside perspective on this and really rationalize it with the market you're in. What are they looking for? And what are the things we do that differentiate ourselves, and what are the things we do that just meet their needs? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, we get really wrapped around the axle in having things that are equally useless and having that.
So we match. So we have all the same unused features and functions that they do.
It's easy to do that.
And it absolutely is. And that's why this is a very simple model, but there are some challenges in implementing, because you've got to think through all the nuances of this decision making.